The Florida sun beat down relentlessly as my dad and I approached Smallwood's store. Standing on cypress stilts over Chokoloskee Bay, its weathered red exterior glowed against the pale sky. Each wooden step groaned under our weight as we climbed toward the entrance, the planks worn so smooth they were almost slippery. Stepping through the propped-open door felt like entering a cave, the interior drastically dark compared to the blinding afternoon light. The air inside hung heavy with the mingled scents of old wood and salt water. Through the wide-open back doors came most of the dim lighting and a welcome breeze. This historic outpost had never been updated with air conditioning. As I moved deeper into the store, dust particles danced in shafts of sunlight, while my footsteps made the floorboards creak loudly. The narrow corridor stretched before me, lined with glass counters and wooden shelves overflowing with artifacts from another time. Fishing lures dangled from ceiling beams alongside crab trap markers. Glass cases displayed rusted tins with faded labels promising cures for tropical ailments, hand-cranked cash registers frozen in time, surrounded by ledgers recording transactions from a century past. Every object told stories of a harsher existence. Florida before golf courses and neatly manicured resort beaches, when daily survival required resilience and sometimes brutality. A large charcoal drawing commanded attention from the wall. The man had pointed eyes like pinpricks, fixed in an unflinching stare. His close-cropped haircut made his ears stick out prominently, while a large mustache connected to a wild beard that flowed down his chest, yet curiously left his chin bare. Surrounding his portrait were handwritten notes resembling museum fact cards, and a carefully drawn map marking the location of his homestead on Chatham Bend. Above it all, a hand-lettered sign read, "Killing Mr. Watson was a community project." "That's Edgar Watson," the woman behind the counter said, noticing my attention fixed on the image. "I'm distantly related to him, actually." She said it matter-of-factly, the way someone might mention a connection to any historical figure, though her slight hesitation suggested the complexity of that particular family tie. Then, they killed him, right out there on that porch. I looked where she pointed, through the open door to the weathered deck overlooking the water. My dad was already out there, taking photos of the exact spot. The same boards where, in October 1910, 24 armed islanders had gathered to confront a man whose violence they could no longer tolerate. The place where Watson had stepped off his boat for the last time, where the crack of a rifle had ended his reign of terror. What drives ordinary people to such extraordinary action? What kind of terror had this man inflicted that made an entire community rise against him? Welcome to Mysteries of the Marsh, where we uncover the Sunshine State's strangest legends, untamed history, and forgotten chapters. I'm Samantha, an 8th-generation Floridian with a fascination for stories that won't stay buried. Like the events that day at Smallwood's store. Edgar Watson's infamous life and death has been covered extensively by crime podcasts and newspaper journals for very good reasons. There's mystery, murder, frontier justice, and the kind of Southern Gothic narrative that makes for a great story. What I find fascinating, however, isn't just the man, it's the environment that made him. The land and the history of our state that led to Watson's inevitable downfall. So grab some bug spray and a really good map, because we're going to navigate our way through the 10,000 islands to track down Edgar Bloody Watson. After the Civil War, Florida was in a state of chaos. Third to secede from the Union, but largely untouched by the physical destruction of battle, its economy nonetheless collapsed with the end of slavery. Reconstruction brought new laws to paper, but the reality on the ground, particularly in the remote southern reaches, was something else entirely. A power vacuum formed that deepened with each mile traveled south from Tallahassee. Captain J.D. Smith wrote in 1875, "No law officer dared to step foot beyond the rail towns, for once a man crossed into the glades, he was beyond the reach of the law." This wasn't exaggeration. It was geographical fact. The federal government had withdrawn its troops, and what passed for local authority rarely extended into the swamps and marshlands that dominated the southern peninsula. By the late 19th century, Florida was America's last true frontier. Land was being practically given away, selling for pennies an acre, or free through homesteading laws if you had the courage to claim it and the resilience to survive. The state actively lured settlers with promise of tropical abundance and easy fortunes, painting pictures of citrus groves and cattle ranches yielding unimaginable wealth. The reality proved drastically different. What awaited these hopeful pioneers were swamps that could swallow a person whole, oppressive heat that brought malaria and yellow fever, and hurricanes that could wipe out entire settlements overnight. In the sparsely populated backwaters, survival required not just strength and determination, but often a willingness to bend rules that no one was there to enforce. Nowhere embodied this lawless frontier more perfectly than the labyrinth of mangroves now called the 10,000 Islands. Stretching from Everglades City down to Cape Sable, this wasn't solid land as most would understand it. It was a constantly shifting maze of shell mounds, sandbars, and sediment deposits, carved by tidal flows and seasonal water patterns into something that defied traditional mapping. The mangrove islands themselves were impenetrable tangles of twisted roots and dense canopy, rising from brackish water and crawling with wildlife, both benign and deadly. Daily life required constant adaptation to an environment that could transform with a single storm. People navigated exclusively by boat through countless unmarked channels that looked identical to the untrained eye. Strangers who entered this watery maze without a guide might never find their way out. Ralph Waldo Emerson had described early Florida as a grotesque place, rapidly settled by public officers, land speculators, and desperados. In the 10,000 Islands, it was primarily the desperados who found their niche. The region's isolation made it perfect for those looking to disappear, escaped convicts, debtors dodging creditors, and men with violent pasts seeking fresh starts. Here, your reputation traveled faster than your history, and knowing the land better than your neighbor meant the difference between prosperity and death. For settlers, it was a brutally hard life that required extraordinary adaptation to survive. For outlaws, it was opportunity, a place they could establish new identities beyond the reach of law and consequences. Disputes were settled with fists or firearms rather than courts. Communities, when they formed at all, created their own codes of conduct, their own systems of justice. This remote waterscape with its maze of tidal streams and dense hammocks of higher ground was where Edgar Watson would carve out his empire. A sugar plantation on Chatham Bend that defied the hostile terrain. In a place where most struggled to grow enough food to survive, Watson's ambition to establish a commercial agricultural operation seemed either visionary or mad. They say Edgar Watson killed his first man when he was just 9 years old. The story, passed down through generations, is more rumor than fact, a dark whisper that clings to the Watson name like a lingering shadow. It happened, so the tale goes, in the early days after the family had left South Carolina for the untamed wilds of frontier Florida. Young Edgar, working in the fields, caught the attention of a farmhand who was unimpressed with the boy's efforts. The man threatened to tell Edgar's father about his lackluster performance. And that, according to the legend, is what sealed the farmhand's fate. Because if there was one thing Edgar feared more than anything, it was his father's wrath. Elijah, ring-eyed Lige, Watson, was a man whose very presence commanded fear. The scar that circled his eye, a souvenir from a long-ago knife fight, served as a constant reminder of his capacity for violence. Elijah's temper was as hot as the Florida sun, his fists as quick as a striking snake. Growing up under Elijah's iron rule, Edgar learned early and often that brutality was the coin of the realm. He watched his father mete out punishment for the slightest infraction, saw how a perceived slight could quickly escalate into a bloody confrontation. So when that farmhand threatened to report Edgar's poor work to Lige, is it any wonder the boy may have resorted to desperate measures? The story offers no details on what happened next, no specifics on how Edgar might have silenced the threat. Those details have been lost to time, blurred and eroded by countless retellings. What endures is the essence of the tale. A young boy, not yet 10 years old, so terrified of his father's anger that he might have resorted to the unthinkable. There is no proof to substantiate this story, no historical record to confirm its veracity. It may be more tall tale than truth, a bit of folklore woven into the dark tapestry of the Watson legacy. But it persists because it speaks to something fundamental about the man Edgar would become. From a tender age, Edgar learned the grim calculus of violence. He absorbed the lesson that brutality could be a tool, a means of survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. But if the story isn't true, it doesn't need to be. Watson would have his first real taste of blood soon enough. It happened in O'Brien, Florida, where Watson's cousin became the first known casualty of his temper. The details have faded with time, but the outcome is clear. A dispute ended in gunfire, and Watson was the only one left standing. Some say it was a matter of land, others that it was money, but no one remembers the cousin's name, and that tells you all you need to know. Because what mattered wasn't the why. What mattered was the who, and what it meant for the man Watson was becoming. No arrest warrant followed, no trial, no consequences. The dead were buried and life went on, just as it always did in the remote, untamed corners of Florida. Watson had seen what happened when his father used violence to get his way. Now, he had tested it for himself, and found it worked just as well for him. For a time, Watson played the role of a respectable man. In 1879, he married Anne Mary Collins, and by all appearances, they lived a typical settler's life in White City. The 1880 census records them like any other struggling farm couple, another entry on a ledger, nothing more. But then, between 1885 and 1888, Anne Mary disappeared. No death certificate, no divorce record, no mention of her ever again. Watson never spoke of her. No one ever asked. And just like before, he moved on. By 1888, Edgar had drifted west, settling in Indian Territory, where he took up land near Belle Starr, the infamous Bandit Queen. He was quiet-spoken, blue-eyed, unassuming to those who met him, a hard worker, a farmer, a man looking for a fresh start. At least, that's how he presented himself. Sometime in 1889, he and Starr quarreled. According to witness accounts, during an argument, Starr reportedly warned Watson, maybe the officers in Florida would like to know where they could find you. Whether she meant it as a warning or a threat, the words hung between them. And then, on February 3, 1889, Belle Starr was shot twice in the back on a lonely stretch of road. Jim July Starr, Belle's husband, took matters into his own hands. Armed with a Winchester rifle and, quote, bad blood in his eyes, he confronted Watson at gunpoint, accusing him of murdering Belle. Watson did not resist. Instead, he maintained his innocence, reportedly telling July, "If you kill me, you kill an innocent man." Jim July then placed Watson under arrest and escorted him to Fort Smith, Arkansas, to face charges in federal court. Belle's daughter, Pearl Younger, even accompanied them, underscoring how strongly the Starr family suspected Watson's guilt. Upon arrival in Fort Smith, Watson was brought before a U.S. commissioner to answer for Belle Starr's murder. Jim July swore out a complaint naming Watson as Belle's killer, presenting evidence that included footprints near the murder scene, and Watson's recently fired shotgun. However, the case quickly unraveled. Despite local suspicion, no eyewitnesses could be produced. In fact, several of Watson's neighbors and local merchants spoke in his defense, describing him as a peaceable, trustworthy man who had caused no trouble in the community. After investigating various accounts of the situation, Commissioner Berzola dismissed the charges and ordered Watson released for insufficient evidence. The Daily Arkansas Gazette noted that the evidence against Watson remained circumstantial and somewhat disconnected. But in September 1889, Watson was arrested again, this time for horse theft in Crawford County, Arkansas. The Mitchell Capital newspaper reported the arrest, describing Watson as E.A. Watson, the assassin, a label that would persist long after the legal proceedings concluded. When he was released, he decided it was time to head back to Florida. Drifting from one farm to another, Watson's reputation for violence continued to grow. In Arcadia, he became involved in a land dispute with Quinn Bass. The disagreement escalated into violence, and Watson killed Bass. He claimed it was self-defense, and with no one willing to challenge his version of events, he was free to leave town without consequence. His pattern was beginning to emerge. Violence solved problems for Watson. And the law? It moved slowly, if at all. Then, in Lake City, a similar conflict with Sam Toland ended with Toland dead. Once again, Watson claimed it was self-defense. Once again, the law let him walk free. But this time, the sheriff gave him a warning. Leave town and never come back. Watson didn't stay. He moved on, always ahead of the law, leaving his mark and then disappearing, never staying long enough for any trouble to actually catch up with him. Edgar Watson arrived at Chatham Bend in 1892, seeking a place where he could build his kingdom. The harsh conditions that kept others away, scorching sun, clouds of mosquitoes, lurking disease, were exactly what attracted him. Here was a blank canvas, far from prying eyes and societal constraints. He purchased 40 acres of swampland that most would have dismissed as worthless, seeing potential where others saw only obstacles. As Peter Matheson wrote in Shadow Country, who else would come to these overflowed, rain-rotted islands with not enough high ground to build an outhouse, and so many skeeters plaguing you in summer you'd think you took the wrong turn to hell? Initially, Watson was embraced by the community. He cut an impressive figure, conveying an image that Peter Matheson captured through the character of Mamie Smallwood. Say what you like about Mr. Watson, he looked and acted like our idea of a hero. Stood there shining in the sun in a white linen suit and a light Panama hat. He carried himself with confidence and charm, impressing neighbors with his ambition and work ethic. Here was a man with vision, who treated people fairly and spoke of grand plans for the region. In 1894, Watson married Jane Dial. Their daughter Lila was born in 1896, followed by son Gene in 1897. The family presented a picture of frontier respectability, as Matheson's fictional account continues through Smallwood's voice. And her on his arm in a wheat brown linen dress and button boots, and sweet baby girl in a brown frock and sunbonnet and a big pink bow. You never seen a more upstanding couple. On the surface, Watson was building not just a plantation, but a life. The transformation of the wilderness into a sugarcane plantation proceeded with remarkable speed. The work was brutal beyond imagination. Men came from all over, drawn by promises of fair wages. From dawn until dusk, they hacked through dense vegetation, their shirts soaked through with sweat, bodies covered in bites and welts. The sugarcane itself was merciless. Its razor-sharp leaves sliced open hands and forearms, leaving cross-hatched patterns of cuts that never fully healed in the humid air. The sawgrass was equally brutal, its serrated edges tearing through clothing and skin with ease. In the swamp's oppressive heat, even minor cuts quickly festered into serious infections. Cane juice mixed with blood and sweat, seeping into open wounds and burning like fire. Fingers grew permanently stained and calloused from the endless cutting, planting, harvesting. Many workers developed a permanent hunch from bending over the fields day after day. The crushing humidity made each breath a struggle, as if the swamp itself were slowly drowning them. As the plantation grew and prospered, a darker side of Watson began to emerge. C.S. Ted Smallwood, a local trader who knew him well, observed the change. It wasn't just loyalty that Watson commanded, he said. It was fear. And for good reason. Whispers began to spread about men who questioned Watson or demanded their rightful pay. Workers had a habit of vanishing without a trace. Laborers would wake to find a bunk empty, possessions abandoned. Someone who had been working alongside them for months would suddenly be gone, their name never mentioned again. These disappearances followed a pattern. A man would argue with Watson over unpaid wages. Harsh words would be exchanged, sometimes threats. Within days, sometimes hours, that worker would vanish. The Collier County News later reported this chilling pattern. People who worked for Watson disappeared soon after asking for their pay. The swamp became an accomplice, swallowing bodies and secrets alike. No one dared to investigate too deeply. The plantation continued to grow, as did Watson's reputation for brutality. His violence wasn't confined to Chatham Bend. During a trip to Key West, Watson nearly killed Adolphus Santini, slashing the man's throat in a dispute that began over a trivial matter, but quickly escalated to bloodshed. Yet while this incident brought legal scrutiny, at his isolated plantation he remained untouchable. Tragedy struck in 1901 when Jane died at just 38 years old. The official cause remained undetermined, but the grinding hardship of life had clearly taken its toll. But Watson remarried in 1905 to a young woman named Edna Bethia. By then, his sugar empire was thriving, but so too was his dark legend. The charming, ambitious man who had first arrived at Chatham Bend had transformed into something else entirely, both king and monster of the 10,000 Islands, his rule absolute, his methods unquestioned. The swamp continued to keep secrets, year after year, as the cane fields expanded and the list of missing men grew longer. Watson seemed invincible in his remote domain, but even the most fearsome tyrants eventually face a reckoning. For Edgar Watson, that day of judgment would come with the same sudden violence that had defined his reign. For years, the settlers of Chokoloskee tolerated Edgar Watson, though never comfortably. His reputation loomed over the community, fueled by the grim stories surrounding his sugarcane farm and the disappearances that plagued it. But the fragile peace they had maintained was about to shatter. The conflict that would seal Watson's fate began with a dispute over land. A squatter named Tucker and his nephew had settled on property near Lost Man's River that Watson claimed as his own. Despite Watson's threats, they refused to leave. In late September 1910, the dispute reached a violent climax. Both Tucker and his nephew were shot and left dead near the riverbank, their bodies later discovered by other settlers. Their deaths struck a nerve in the community. Unlike transient laborers, whose disappearances often went unnoticed, these men were familiar faces. The murders of Tucker and his nephew shocked the settlement. Rumors circulated that Watson had even bragged about the killings during a trip to Fort Myers, further incensing the townspeople. This was not just a crime. It was a blatant challenge to the community. Watson's unchecked violence, combined with his audacity in claiming the disputed land, proved too much. The settlers realized they could no longer tolerate his reign of terror. It was William Brown who finally took the community's frustrations to the authorities. Traveling to Fort Myers, he stood before Sheriff Frank Tippins and pleaded for action. He spoke plainly, delivering a warning that carried the weight of the town's fury. "If you don't act, we will." But the sheriff's hands were tied, or so he claimed. The land on Chatham Bend fell under the jurisdiction of Monroe County, and Collier County didn't yet exist. With no law enforcement willing to intervene, Watson's grip on the islands remained unchallenged. For the people of Chokoloskee, the choice was clear. If no one else was going to stop Edgar Watson, they would. The hurricane that ravaged the 10,000 Islands in the fall of 1910 was more than just a natural disaster. It was a catalyst, a turning point that would set in motion the final act of Edgar Watson's reign of terror. Watson, who had been away on business when the storm struck, returned to find his plantation in ruins. The hurricane had torn through Chatham Bend, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. This devastation, coupled with the recent murders, pushed the islanders to their breaking point. Fear gave way to anger, and whispers turned to accusations. The people of Chokoloskee, once intimidated by Watson's power, were now ready to confront him. They had endured his violence for far too long, and the hurricane seemed to be the final sign they needed to act. Watson, sensing the shift in the community's attitude, attempted to deflect the blame. He arrived at the Smallwood store, the heart of the community, and declared that he had killed his foreman, Leslie Cox, accusing him of the murders that had shaken the islands. But the townspeople didn't believe him. They had seen through his lies and manipulations. and they were no longer willing to be controlled by his fear-mongering. When Watson stepped off his boat that day, a group of armed men were waiting. They had come to end his reign of terror, to bring justice to the islands he had held in his grip for so long. The air crackled with tension as Watson faced the mob. He knew his time was up, but he refused to go down without a fight. He reached for his gun, but it was too late. The townspeople opened fire, their shots tearing through the humid air. Watson, caught in a hail of bullets, staggered and fell. Some accounts say he fell slowly, like a tree being felled, refusing to go down easily, even in death. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the lapping of the waves against the shore. Watson's body, riddled with bullets, lay lifeless on the porch of the Smallwood store, a stark reminder of the violence that had plagued the islands for years. The mob, their adrenaline fading, looked at each other in stunned silence. They had done what they had to do, but the weight of their actions was heavy on their hearts. They had taken a life, but they had also freed themselves from the tyranny of a man who had held them captive for far too long. Watson's body was unceremoniously dragged behind a boat to Rabbit Key, a small, desolate island nearby. There he was buried in a shallow grave, coral rocks piled on top to keep him from washing away. It was over. Edgar J. Watson, the man who had ruled the islands through fear and violence, was dead. But the story didn't end there. Watson's family, including his wife, children, and son-in-law Walter Langford, stepped in to ensure he was given a proper burial. Langford took on the task of recovering Watson's remains, transporting the body to Fort Myers. The family laid Watson to rest in the family plot. This act was more than just a burial. It symbolized the family's attempt to reclaim some dignity for Watson in death, despite the infamy surrounding his life. For the community of Chokoloskee, the removal of Watson's body from the islands was a final step in distancing themselves from his violent legacy. Though his name continued to evoke fear and controversy, his physical absence allowed the settlers to focus on rebuilding their lives and moving forward from the dark chapter he had defined. Standing on the porch of the Smallwood store, the same weathered planks where Edgar Watson breathed his last, the weight of history feels palpable. The sun dips towards the horizon, casting long shadows across Chokoloskee Bay, just as it did on that fateful October day in 1910. Watson's reign of terror is over, his sugarcane empire swallowed by the relentless wilderness. But the story of his life and death continues to echo through these islands, a reminder of the darkness that can fester in the most isolated corners of the world. Yet the Smallwood store endures, this resilient building with its creaking floorboards and whispered tales of a bygone era stands as a testament to the strength and spirit of the people who call these islands home. It's a place where the past and present converge, where the echoes of violence and ambition mingle with the quiet resilience of a community determined to survive. The building is more than just a museum. It's a living monument to the enduring spirit of the 10,000 islands. It's a place where history is not just preserved, but celebrated, where the stories of those who came before us continue to inspire and inform the generations that follow. Thank you for joining me on this journey into Florida's untamed history. The Smallwood store, with its echoes of Edgar Watson's reign and the resilience of the community that survived him, is just one of the many places where the Sunshine State's enigmatic tales come to life. And I encourage you to visit, to step back into time yourself. And I wanted to end this episode with a massive thank you to everyone listening and to everyone that has shared this podcast. This is entirely a labor of love for both the state I grew up in and the stories I love so much. And it has meant the world to see the listener count grow day by day. There's a lot more stories coming soon, and a website, and maybe if people are interested, some stickers. So hopefully you continue to stick around for more mysteries. Until next time, don't feed the gators.